This is a new Sony A7CR, a compact body the size of a small Fujifilm camera that borrows almost every single feature from the A7R5 with a 61 megapixel sensor, but it also has some tricks up its sleeve to make it work super well in both worlds. So after a couple weeks of using this, let's talk about it. Now, I want to give a big thanks to Sony for sending this out before, I guess, it officially exists to the public. But that being said, this is not sponsored by Sony. They're not seeing this, any of that kind of stuff. But if you do want to support the channel, you can check out my presets and LUTs. The links to those are in the description down below. And if you want to learn more from me, a full-time professional photographer, in depth, more behind the scenes, editing, all that kind of stuff, you can jump on the Patreon below as well. It's a monthly subscription thing, but I put out new videos every single month, and there is a back catalog of 3 years worth of videos on there that you can check out as well. So right off the bat, the internals of this camera are pretty much identical to the A7R5. It has that same 61 megapixel sensor, which is pretty ridiculous in such a small form factor here. It has the same new AI processing chip that is also found in the A7R5, but actually isn't found in the A7 IV. And for a quick spoiler, I don't have the A7C II, but that camera actually does have the AI processor that the A7 IV doesn't have. So it's one of Sony's both like pros and cons that anytime they get new features, they just shove them into every camera they have, which as a consumer is fantastic, but it makes people that already own their cameras a little bit disappointed, I guess. So it's kind of like the opposite of them holding back features. They're just always shoving every new feature into every single camera, which I guess I would definitely prefer over a company holding those features back. Now, to continue with the similarities between the current Sony Alpha cameras, obviously the body is a lot smaller, and because of that, you're going to be making some compromises. Most notably for me, at least, you only get one card slot, which for many people on the more professional level is going to definitely be a deterrent over buying this versus something that is going to have dual card slots. If you're going to be doing video that you're going to be outputting it, it does have a micro HDMI port. Not the worst thing in the world, but I guess it's notable in this situation. It definitely has a few less custom buttons and things than a full-size camera, which you're going to be expecting. It does have a front wheel here to adjust things like shutter speed or aperture, as well as a back one and a full scroll wheel. It does not have a joystick, but that's one of the things that I don't actually end up really using anyway, because I'm so used to just kind of setting my autofocus point in the middle and then tracking via that whole situation. If there's going to be a camera that doesn't have a joystick, I'm pretty much fine with it being a Sony camera because their autofocus is just so good. That's pretty much one of the main reasons for someone like myself to own some Sony cameras, is they're just incredible autofocus. For all of my portrait work, wedding work, all that kind of stuff, this thing is legitimately fantastic. It's better than the A7 IV and right on par with the A7R5. Now I'll talk about the little flip screen as well as the viewfinder a bit later, but right off the bat, I just want to focus on how incredibly small this thing is. So obviously this is going to look like one of the biggest flexes of all time in terms of just the amount of cameras on here, but this is what I have available and wanted to just show you all the differences between all of these different things so you have a really good idea of how this camera actually feels and comparing it to some things that some of you may be a little bit familiar with. So this is the Fujifilm X100F. It doesn't have any sort of grip on it or anything like that. And I don't know if you can tell via the little secondary angle I have here, but it's shorter than the X100F. And in terms of body size, it is almost identical. So yes, you are going to have a bit of a larger lens going on here, obviously, because the lens on the X100 series is so small. You can tell the body is a little bit bigger as well. But overall, they are very similar in size, other than obviously the lens. And I will say that this is the smallest Sony autofocus lens that I've used, at least. It's the 24mm f2.8G. They also make a 40mm 2.4 and a 50mm 2.4. And I've recently purchased these little Haug lens hoods to kind of complete the look of the camera here. So to have a really small and compact camera setup here it is just fascinating how small this is. I wanted to also compare it to the X100V and the XE4. When you stick all these together, they are all obviously very, very similar in size. The A7CR is the shortest out of all of them. And in terms of body size, they're all about the same. The only thing that the A7CR has over the other ones is a built-in grip that's a little bit bigger. Personally, I really appreciate that. As you can see on the XE4 here, as well as the X100V, I've put grips on them. Also, just for comparison, here it is next to the Leica M10 and a Leica M6. It's like maybe a millimeter shorter than an M6, so pretty impressive there. As far as body size goes, it's a little bit thinner in that way. So again, it's definitely larger than the Leicas here by a slight margin in those aspects. But in terms of actually weight and carryability, it's definitely significantly lighter. And I don't think anybody is going to be talking about a Leica like this being difficult to carry around, especially with a really small lens like this 28mm Summicron. Now, enough ranting about the size of this little thing. Obviously, it's small. That's the point of this whole camera system. But most of my other glass that I really love, like this 35 or this 50mm, once you kind of swap out for a larger lens like that, you're kind of like losing out on the whole portability of it. I will say that this isn't the worst thing in the world, but I mean, I don't even have like pinky room here to move. So you're definitely going to have more issues in a much smaller version like this. Like, I mean, it doesn't even touch the ground, right? So in the few days that I had this before the briefing, I was looking up thumb grips. I was looking up a little external undergrip here. And as I did get the briefing, I realized that there was something else in the package that completely changes the game on a small camera like this. While, yes, I'm sure other people are going to copy this grip and all that kind of stuff, it completely transforms this tiny camera from something small like this into something just as ergonomic as the larger Sony Alpha cameras. You can see that once we actually put them next to each other, the A7CR might even be like a couple millimeters taller because this grip is so deep that I actually have room under my pinky, which is very, very rare in any camera. As you can see here, I normally put this little small rig grip and Arca plate on all of my cameras because I have a little bit larger hands. I purposely took the one off the A7 IV here, and you can see that my pinky is just kind of missing off of here, even when in like kind of like a shooting position of sorts. I mean, it just doesn't exactly work. So on all of my Sony cameras, I have these little base plates. But the amazing thing here is, of all of them, this one actually fits the best, which is crazy because then I can take a really, really small package and transform it into something that is just as ergonomic, if not better in some ways, than the full-sized, normal kind of like SLR style bodies here. Now, the other thing that is frankly just a different experience overall when comparing this directly to the A7R5 is going to be the viewfinder and the back LCD screen. So while the viewfinder on the A7CR is going to be a disappointment for many, honestly, I don't really find it that big of an issue. The experience on the A7R5 is legitimately really, really great. It's a large viewfinder. This one obviously is going to be a lot smaller, but the main thing in using the two of them is going to be the experience. And as you can see by my collection of cameras that are all on an offset viewfinder, it's something that I really appreciate. If you have a viewfinder up to your eye like this on an offset viewfinder, half of my face is still available to a subject. So being able to sort of mirror what I'm looking for out of a subject by smiling, by just doing whatever I can to, help people be comfortable. I think that having an offset viewfinder does a lot of that. And also it just is less intimidating because you have a camera that you're looking at a person with a tool in front of their face instead of a person with a tool in front of their entire face. Sure, you can open your eye here, but when you look at someone, you're not seeing a person when you have something like this up to your eye versus this. It's just a very, very different experience. So I don't really have any complaints about a smaller viewfinder here. I'm not exactly sure all of the specifications on that, other than to say that it's better than a lot of these viewfinders, I'm sure, and I would have no problem doing professional work with it. If I'm going to complain about something on this camera though, it's going to be that rear LCD screen. Sony has now just completely spoiled us with this incredible screen on the A7R5. This is now what I consider to be like the gold standard. We have the ability for it to just fold out like a photography focused camera should. So when I opened this up and saw that it had just a normal kind of fold out flippy screen here, it's, again, not the worst thing in the world, and I wasn't necessarily expecting it out of this, but if I did have the option, I would pay more money legitimately to have this screen on a camera like this. And personally, I would prefer to have a just basic screen that folds out, even like this little one on the X100V does. I feel like this particular kind of screen setup at minimum is the kind of LCD screen that I would anticipate coming in a photography focused camera. And the fact that it doesn't, not a deal breaker, but it is a massive quality of life improvement on a camera like this. Now, for a few more internal specs of sorts, this is, I think, 53% smaller than the A7R5. It's 29% lighter. I've used the A6700 and it's only just like a little bit larger than that when kind of broken down without the additional grip here. It has the AI processing, and again, I think the A7C II does as well. So you're definitely getting more accurate autofocus, so like smarter autofocus. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be faster in terms of moving the elements in the lens, but it's going to be smarter, more accurate, all that kind of stuff. What's also kind of wild is they have updated the IBIS from, I believe, 5 stops in the first A7C to 7 stops. The A7R5, I believe, has 8 stops of IBIS, which is crazy. But what I find most interesting in here is this has 7 stops of IBIS, and the A7 IV only has 5.5 stops. So you're getting a better IBIS system in a compact body than you are in a large body like this, which again is pretty crazy. It has all the same video features. The only one it does not have is 8K, but again, you're not going to be probably using this as your primary video camera, and 8K just isn't really necessary in 99% of things. And if you do want 8K, you're probably going to buy the A1 or the A7R5, something like that, that might dissipate heat a little bit better. That being said, one of the first things I did, because I knew people were going to be interested, was toss this thing on 4K 24 and just let it run. It ran for almost 3 hours at 4K 24. And at that point, I just gave up. We hit 3 hours and I just turned it off because it was kind of pointless after that. If you're going to be walking around and using 4K 60 or any of the other modes that are higher speeds, whatnot, I'm sure it'll overheat. But if you're just going to use it, even in a warmer environment, in like a studio setup or a setup where you're using it as a webcam, things like that as kind of like auxiliary video camera, if you're using it in 24 frames per second, I used it in temperatures of upper 70s Fahrenheit and had 0 issues. Again, it went for 3 hours. So for my particular use cases, I could definitely use it as my main camera for this kind of thing with no problem. Oddly enough, one of the things it does have in the video department that the A7R5 doesn't, which I'm thinking they need to put that in here, it's absurd that they don't have it, especially on something like this, is that AI reframing. So having the ability to have it crop in on such a large sensor as well and give you the ability to kind of reframe, and you can move around the frame, all that kind of stuff. Really great for things like social media. And especially if you are going to be taking this out as kind of your only camera, it's fun that it has literally everything you could put in a camera. So overall, we already know that the 61 megapixel sensor out of here is incredible. You get like 15 plus stops of dynamic range. It does pretty good in low light, especially considering the high megapixel count. And because it has that high megapixel count, you can do more with all of the denoising and whatnot. I think overall, the upgrade of being able to have two different cameras with the same sensor is going to help my workflow in terms of the slight variations in color, as well as just giving clients a more consistent output in not having just like one camera that's giving you 61 megapixels and another is giving you 33. I will say if you're not doing something like weddings that you want a higher megapixel count, the A7C II is probably going to be a much better value because it gets the AI processing, the better IBIS, a lot of those kind of things in a small package like this. So honestly, someone like myself, if you are okay with the workarounds and you understand how you're going to use them, having one of these cameras and one of these cameras in your kit is a pretty sweet setup as long as you know how to use them together properly, I guess. So thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks again to Sony for sending this out. And if you're interested in more of my thoughts comparing the A7 IV and the A7R5, you can check that out up here. Check out my first video on my first thoughts on the A7R5 right here, and then I will see you in one of those videos.